your bibliographies and whatnot. I've got the morning set aside to do those and my other classes as well. And Tuesday. You guys are Tuesday. On Tuesday, we'll have a chance to sort of talk about the midterm. I'll have the study materials up for that because that's 2 weeks in advance of the midterm. So I'll put up a study sheet. We'll go over that. We'll go over a little mock exam so you have an idea of what to expect. Right? The slide list that I put up will probably be longer than the stuff that we get through because I don't know how far we're going to get prior to the midterm. But the midterm is 2 weeks from Tuesday, right? So it's right before, I believe that's the week before spring break, right? And I don't know if that's before midterm grades are due or not. I think it is as well. So that will be factored in with your worksheets to your midterm grade as well, okay? So, if you're planning on not being here on Monday, that might not be the best day to miss because we'll be talking about, that'll be our chance to talk about the final. And we'll obviously do it probably one more time before the final takes place because then we can, you'll have a better sense and all know where we are, right? Okay? So expect that then on Tuesday. Back to the works at hand, we were talking about the early Renaissance in the 15th century. And I've sort of been talking about phases of the Renaissance, right? We sort of saw Giotto, Duccio, Simone Martini being an early phase, which is really just a return to naturalism, a return to sort of a realistic kind of three-dimensional art based on having looked at Roman art, right? Ancient Roman art. And then this next phase in the 15th century in Italy, and remember that Renaissance is really an Italian phenomenon, right? They're reviving their national historical past. And that Van Eyck isn't, right? Van Eyck isn't really Renaissance in the same way because there's no conscious sense of revival. Whereas in Italy it is, and in fact they even said it themselves, right? It's one of our first art periods where the people defined it, the people who were doing it, not as historians, looking back and saying, oh, they're this, right? They said that they were breaking with the past. They said they were reviving their own national traditions, right? So in the second phase here, the early Renaissance of the 15th century, as opposed to the proto-Renaissance of the 14th century, what we see is a return to Roman body types, Roman anatomy, Greco-Roman, ancient anatomy structures. Donatello looking back, as we saw at Praxiteles, Masaccio looking back at Greek and Roman statues as well, and incorporating them into a Christian subject matter, right? Our third phase, which we may get to later today, will begin to also bring in Roman subject matter for its own sake, right? And that's kind of in the high Renaissance. And we already saw Botticelli's Birth of Venus on Tuesday, right? There's a Roman subject matter, right? It may be analogous to Christianity. It may be analogous to the Virgin Mary, but it's a Roman subject matter in and of itself. At this early phase, we're not seeing much of that, right? So as we move in, that doesn't mean that religious pictures go away by any means. It just will be a sort of a third phase to the Renaissance. So historians often talk about the Renaissance as having this very early phase, proto-Renaissance, Giotto, Duccio, interrupted by the Black Plague. Then there's the sort of the early Renaissance, Masaccio, Donatello, early Botticelli, Fra Filippo Lippi. And then there's the high Renaissance, which are our heavy hitters, Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, right? There's our kind of historical overview on this, right? So we left off talking about the Medici family as patrons of the arts. And beginning with Cosimo de' Medici, the father of the family, if you will. That's how they referred to him, right? The pater patriae, the father of the family. We get a very strong interest in using art as investments, as ways of proclaiming their greatness, but really very, very strong patronage of the arts. And so Botticelli's Madonna and Child from the National Gallery is a Medici work. We know it was made for them, even though it resembles other Madonnas. This one was specialized for them. And the throne that she sits on has the Medici coat of arms with those 5 hemispheres, those 5 gold balls that adorn the throne. That's the Medici coat of arms. And they added a 6th one in 1465, so we know that this is prior to that. Right? That's how we know. Because it has the earlier coat of arms, not the one with 6 around the center. Right? We have 5 balls around the center. Okay? The David on your left, also for the Medici family, to be displayed inside of their palace because they couldn't put it up outside. Right? It was against the law in Florence for an individual to erect a public monument. But David is a very public monument because he means Florence to people from Florence, right? He is their mirror, right? He defeats giants. And the Medici put it inside of their palace so that visitors would see that, okay, David may be Florence, but you know what? David is also the Medici family. So if you think about the transitive property, right? If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, right? So if David is Florence and David is the Medici are Florence, right? And that's exactly what was going on behind the scenes. You know, they were not elected as leaders, but all of their flunkies were. Right? So this interest in David is not only limited to the Medici family, however. That said, other people commissioned images of David based on this one, probably to show their fidelity, their allegiance to the Medici family. So we have, there are 2 brothers, Bernardo and Antonio Rossellino, who were sculptors at the same time as Donatello, not famous enough to make the Ninja Turtles, right? And this one carved out of marble rather than cast in bronze. David, instead of holding the sword, is still holding the sling, right? With the stone in the sling coming down the side. But you can tell from looking that, except for the nudity part, a really close analogy between the Rossellino work and the Donatello work. Still with his foot directly on Goliath's head, clothed but without the helmet, maybe without some of the wonderful sensitivity and interest in touch, palpability that Donatello has. But certainly the Martelli family commissioned this in homage to the one that was owned by the Medici family. And anybody that would have seen this in their palazzo would have realized this was a sign of their fidelity, of their connection. Because having such a connection to such a powerful family is a good thing. And it seems as if at many places in their careers or in their history, the Medici family asked for people to sort of display their, fidelity, right? It makes it sound kind of like The Godfather. You know what I mean? One day I'll come to you and I'll ask you for a favor, right? That's my bad Marlon Brando at the beginning of The Godfather. One day I'll ask you for a favor. You don't know when, where, but I will ask you to do something for me, right? And that's kind of the same idea, that the Medici are asking for allegiance, right? And asking for shows of allegiance. And the Martelli family gives them one with our image. Right? I don't know why this slide looks this way when it should look this way. I guess I have an extra slide in my PowerPoint, right? Another David-based work in the National Gallery is this. You might remember this from the worksheets, right? This shield. It's painted on a physical 3-dimensional object. It's a wooden shield with a leather cover. And on the back are straps so you can carry it like a military shield. But it was not meant to be used in battle, obviously, because you wouldn't go through the trouble to paint a shield that you're going to take out and get hacked up, right? Same thing with armor. We find sometimes there's what's called ceremonial armor that's highly, highly decorated. And the sort of thing that you would wear sort of parading around. Our president wants a military parade, right? Parading around in military costume, right? And our generals do the same thing, right? The things that they would wear if our generals are going to be in a parade of any kind or any kind of ceremony, right? The things that they wear in ceremony are not the things that they would wear in battle. Not that anybody even marches into battle anymore, right? I mean, everything's push a button and things happen. So this is meant for parade, right? To be carried around. And Florence had many different parades. In fact, one of the most famous ones, the Medici March, this is a great little story, right? One of the most famous of these annual parades that you could see in Florence was held on January 6th, which is the Feast of the Epiphany. It celebrates the arrival of the three wise men, the Magi, at the crib, right? And there was a parade in Florence for this every year, and it was sponsored by the Medici, and they would march dressed up as the three Magi at the front of the parade, which is weird and cool at the same time. Yeah, and strange, right? Kind of almost blasphemous in modern thinking. So this was meant to be carried in a parade, and the question is, who carried it? We don't know, right? It's a unique object in that there are no other shields from the Renaissance in Florence with biblical scenes painted on them. All of the other shields that we have that have paintings on them have coats of arms of different families. So what you would do, there's my family honor. And that's enough to make us think that maybe this is a Medici thing then, even though there are no Medici coat of arms on it. Something about the David would identify the person carrying it. Now, who knows? Maybe it was just the town magistrate. David is Florence, after all. We don't know, right? Or it could be a family that, like the Martelli family, is showing their allegiance to the Medici. But what it shows us very much is how important David was to the people of Florence, right? Sometimes, and could be used in different ways, as personal propaganda, to show allegiance, or to simply show civic pride, right? David played a very, very strong role in the civic identity of Florence in the 15th century. He again shows us this interest in looking back at Roman art. And the pose of the David, and you can see Goliath's head nicely. It's like he went down there and he arranged it for the painter, you know. Turn it so it faces you. And he's still got the sling there. But the actual pose with his arm up, singing the armies, is actually derived from a relatively well-known Roman statue called the Pedagogue. Not that that really matters, right? But even though it doesn't look like contrapposto pose, it's again this symbol that we're seeing, this manifestation that we're seeing in the 15th century of artists looking back at ancient Rome and incorporating those poses into their works. Right? Here's a piece of that ceremonial armor. Look at that. I'd like to have that, right? Not in the statue, which is gorgeous, but that piece of armor with that screaming thing on his chest, right? Giuliano de' Medici. This is the grandson of Cosimo, right? And a portrait bust made of him, probably at the time that he was had his ceremony for his coming of age. Usually, if you're the scion of a major family, right, the oldest son of the major family, that family will have a coming-of-age celebration. And in Florence in the 15th century, they modeled them on court celebrations from the Middle Ages. Right? And coming of age was 25. Right? And Giuliano was born in 1450. Right? So we think around 1475. It can't be after 1478 because he dies young. Dies at 28. So it's somewhere right in there, right, based on the age. And he's in the kind of armor that he would have worn at this celebration that the family staged to sort of welcome him into manhood, right? And it's actually the kind of armor you would never ever wear anywhere else because it's far too costly, right? Just like the shield on your right is not something you would carry anywhere. For these celebrations, what was the norm in the Middle Ages at court was to have a series of jousts, right? Sometimes the honoree would take part in the joust as well, right? Horseback, lances, you get the idea, right? But knock each other off the horse, sort of thing. I doubt he would have worn something like that in the joust, but he would have worn in the stands watching the others, right? And that became part of this broader celebration of his coming of age, right? I don't know why. I got some slides out of order here. I'm not quite sure what's going on here. So this is what I meant to have. So he is, I don't know why that's doing that. He is the grandson of Cosimo de' Medici on the right, who we've seen before, the one who supported Fra Angelico's work at San Marco. Okay, there's our wonderful piece of armor and a close-up of it. This is in terracotta, which is to say clay, right? So it's hollow, baked, and you can see the clayishness in his hair a bit, and here. That suggests it might have been the model for something else, maybe the model for a cast of some sort. We're not 100% sure. The artist here, Andrea del Verrocchio, is one of the more important artists of the end of the 15th century in Florence. He ran a sculpture workshop, training other artists. He was also a painter. And he was Botticelli's second teacher, and he was Leonardo da Vinci's teacher. Right? So he had some really prominent pupils, and was really one of the most sought after and recognized sculptors of the last part of the 15th century, after the death of Donatello. Now we're back on track now. These jousts that were held for Giuliano de' Medici at his coming of age in 1475 were actually held in honor of Simonetta Vespucci, who was like Giuliano's best friend. And this is something that's a little hard for modern people to get their minds around, but they had a very deep, very emotional, platonic relationship. And we talk about that today, so platonic friendship. That means that you're not, that obviously comes from Plato, right? And it means that it's a sort of, no romance. It's just deep intellectual engagement, right? And it's hard for us to think about that today because having something like that just sounds like there's got to be something else going on. But it was part of the culture at the time. Very common for people to have these kinds of relationships, men and women, even if both of them are otherwise married. And there's no evidence at all that there was ever any hanky-panky, right? Just a deep emotional and intellectual relationship. And he had one with her. And you recognize the last name? She's like the niece of Amerigo Vespucci, right? After which the country's named, right? So she's part of that same family. And it's nice to think about these things going on. We're studying the art. We have to remember that this is also the age of exploration, right? And Amerigo is, I believe, her uncle. Is that right? Cousin to Amerigo, right? So no physical love, but deep, deep devotion between him and Simonetta. And the jousts, going again, following on the medieval traditions, were in honor of his coming of age, but then dedicated to a woman, because in the Middle Ages they would have been dedicated to the queen. Right? So Simonetta becomes now this focal point for Giuliano de' Medici. And this becomes kind of an important thing for us because she dies as well very young. She dies the year after these celebrations. In 1476, Simonetta Vespucci dies. And then 2 years later, when he's only 27, 28 years old, Giuliano de' Medici dies. Right? So there's some tragedy that's lurking around behind these things during the times that they were made, right? And it's altogether possible that this could commemorate something that happened in 1475, but be made at a later date, recalling that event. And the death of Simonetta suggests one of the reasons why he might have wanted to do that. Right? To remember the jousts in honor of now the departed beloved. I don't want to say lover, right? Beloved. Yeah. The death of Simonetta also seems to be behind this portrait by Botticelli of Giuliano, right? Also at the National Gallery. As does the death of Giuliano himself in 1478. Because you'll notice that what Botticelli does is he paints a frame within the frame. And again, perspective is obviously on his mind. And I haven't traced it out to figure out where the vanishing point is, right? But you'll see that there's a base down below with a bird on a branch. We'll talk about that in a second. And then a sort of a marble frame inside the actual physical frame that opens up to this room, this very shallow room. And the back of that room has a window. And one of the shutters of the window is open to the great beyond. And there's nothing out there, not like Van Eyck, right, where there's a little city in the background or something. There's nothing back there. And that fact that it just opens to the void suggests to us that that's a reference to the death of Giuliano, that this is a posthumous portrait, right? That it was painted in memory of Giuliano after his death. And that would also make sense given what we know about the status of the Medici family and the way in which they inspired others to demonstrate their allegiance. What better way to demonstrate your allegiance than to have a portrait of one of the members hanging in your house as well? And I should mention that I don't have them to show you here, so you have to believe me. Botticelli painted about 5 or 6 of these that survive today, which means he probably painted more of them, right? And by far, ours is the best, right? The other ones don't have a background. They're not as well detailed. They seem to be copies after this one, which could mean that this one was the model that he used for the others, or it could mean that this one went to a very prominent patron and the other ones were just kind of knockoffs to put in the barber shop, right? Like when I lived in New York back in the day, it's a long time ago now, right? It's been 30 years since I moved to New York. It's too old. But you go to the Greek coffee shops and they always had pictures of Kennedy on the wall. You know, back in the 80s, everybody had a picture of Kennedy on the wall. If you walk to any of the little Greek coffee shops, you know, it's our pleasure to serve you, the blue cups and everything. And that idea of just displaying somebody that you're proud to have had some connection to is not necessarily a new idea, right? And so for the Renaissance, these portraits served the same purpose, right? Someone you're proud to have a connection to. You want to make sure everybody knows that you have that connection. Right? So that's probably who this was originally made for. Right? The bird in the foreground probably relates to Simonetta Vespucci. It's a dove on a branch, and doves were believed to mate for life. And again, this brings up the idea of sex, but there's no sex involved, right? They are devoted for life. And that, again, by legend, the only place a dove would perch when its beloved died would be on a dead branch. That's what they believed. So the dove on the dead branch is a loaded symbol and certainly relates to the death of Simonetta. Right? She's gone. The bird is him, perched on a dead branch. Right? Still devoted. But the only place he'll land now is on this dead branch. Now, the subsequent death of Giuliano is one of the great scandals of the 15th century. It's an amazing story, the death of Giuliano de' Medici. It was a conspiracy against him. The Medici, over the decades of governing Florence behind the scenes, of getting their people elected to every public office, and thus being able to steer all of the laws to favor them, you might imagine would meet with some resistance in a country, or in this case, a duchy that duchy is not the right word, city that valued representative government, right? And there were numerous times when there were uprisings against the Medici. So in 1434, Cosimo got kicked out of the city, right? Was able to come back, work it out to come back. Later in 1492, Giuliano's brother Lorenzo will get kicked out of the city as well, right? They just get tired of this stuff. And in 1478, there was a family led by the Pazzis, P-A-Z-Z-I, the Pazzi family. I'm sorry, it didn't come up here on the slide. It should. The Pazzi family got all of the enemies of the Medici together, and they decided that they wanted to overthrow the Medici. The problem is you can't overthrow somebody if they're not really in power, right? So how do you overthrow somebody who's ruling from behind the scenes, right? You whack them, as they say in the Godfather movies, right? You kill them. And so that's what the Pazzi family decides. We have got to kill the heirs to the Medici throne. And at this point, the heirs are Giuliano and his brother Lorenzo, right? And they're both roughly the same age. Giuliano's a little bit older, I think. And their father's very old. So this is like, cutting it off at the legs, right? This will get rid of the Medici dynasty if we can kill Lorenzo and Giuliano. But the problem is getting to him, right? Doesn't it sound like a gangster film? The problem is, how are we going to do this? They've got too many people on their side. They're never let their guard down. How are we going to kill these two guys? We got to do it once as well. Because if we kill just one of them, we're in trouble, right? They'll come back and they'll get us. They decide, and you can't make this kind of stuff up. Let's get them in church. Easter Sunday morning, 1478. They'll have their guard down. They won't be expecting this at all, right? So they get them to the Medici in the front pew in the cathedral in Florence. Easter Sunday, the Pazzi and their conspirators are waiting where the priest prepares the sacrament. The priest has come out with the sacrament. He's now at the altar, the Medici are right in front. And the Pazzi and the conspirators are waiting in the sacristy, right? And what they're waiting for is a signal. Nothing that will tip off the Medici, but when the priest blesses the sacrament and everybody turns to look, behold, the body of Christ which is broken for you. And the priest will hold it up and all eyes are on that, right? They ring a bell in the church. That's what they're waiting for. They hear the bell, they know the Medici will be focused on this, come out of the side again, right? That's the plan. So they're there, they hear the bell, all eyes are on it. They storm out. The night before, Lorenzo and Giuliano were out partying. Giuliano twisted his ankle. He couldn't get away. Knifed to death in the cathedral, Easter Sunday morning, by the Pazzi family. Lorenzo gets away. And Lorenzo goes apeshit. It's just, did you ever see, has anybody seen The Godfather?
Of course.
Well, you're older. If you haven't, one of the greatest American films ever made. If you haven't seen The Godfather, it's on Netflix for free right now this month. Go watch it tonight, and watch it again tomorrow because it's just that good. At the end of The Godfather, Michael is in church. He's Marlon Brando's son, right? And that was my other Marlon Brando. The only Marlon Brando impression I do is when I say Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando's son is now taking over the family business, right? And the whole story is him moving from being a goody two-shoes to being the next Don of the Mafia. And he's in church taking care of, not actually baptizing, but in the baptismal ceremony of his son, right? I think it's his son. And as they are...
It's
his sister, so it's his nephew.
And
And he's there in church. And he orders that because the families had tried to
he's becoming Godfather.
He's becoming the Godfather, exactly right. And as he becomes the Godfather 2 and 3, which I never saw because I heard it sucked.
You have to watch it.
I have the box. I got the set. Okay. My wife bought it for me for my birthday years ago. As the ceremony is going on, the camera keeps cutting from the ceremony to the fact that he's having all of his enemies whacked. Right? Just one after the other, after the other, after the other. And there's this wonderful play between him public face of goodness, right, in the church, and the evil that he's having done.
He's becoming the godfather
That's right.
twice simultaneously.
Oh, that's right. So yes, he's becoming the godfather of the son, but he's also now becoming the godfather of the family, right? That's exactly what happened in 15th century Florence, right? In the aftermath of the murder of Giuliano de' Medici, Lorenzo had all of the male members of the Pazzi family killed. And he had the children and the women exiled from Florence. Right? He just went on this rampage. And he made all of the families that had to, you either say you're in total allegiance with the Medici, or you're in trouble, right? And he just went through the city and he sort of wiped out people in 1478 in revenge for his brother, who's killed more or less in front of his eyes, right? As they were trying to escape. Which, again, could you make something like this up? Easter Sunday morning during Mass, right? Is how this happens, right? Well, then the people that remained faithful to the Medici family, he wanted them to, again, demonstrate their allegiance. And what he had, we know from the records, is that he had people put up wax busts of Lorenzo in their house, carved from not just candle wax, right, but something that would hold up in the Italian heat, right, wax busts. And the reason you use wax is they're relatively cheap and you can make them quickly, right? Not as hard to carve as clay, no after effects, and certainly not like bronze, okay? And these were based, we find out, on an original that was sculpted by Verrocchio, who we saw already had done the bust of Giuliano, right? So they hired him to make the original. Well, we've got this. This one is in terracotta and painted. That's Lorenzo. I wouldn't mess with him, right? I mean, just looking about as mean as he can possibly look, right? And we think that this was the original after which all of the wax copies were made, right? And to demonstrate now your allegiance, right, to Lorenzo. So we go back to this thing. I think I mentioned this on Tuesday. There was I can't remember if it was History Channel or PBS, called them the Godfathers of the Renaissance. This is really true. In fact, by 1527, a Medici is elected Pope. Right? They just keep moving up through the ranks despite what else happens. Right? Pope Clement VII.
Also a Godfather plotline.
And it is a Godfather. That's in part 3. I read about that. Okay. Maybe I'll have to go and watch that, but I've got papers to grade this weekend. I'm not watching anything this weekend, right? Okay, so you can see, I think, with the two of them, also the family resemblance. They have heavy chins or squat nose, but Lorenzo here is really trying to look about as bad as he can. And as you might imagine, there's very, very good reason for this at this point in his career. Right. So there's our great story about the Medici, right? And really, we're not going to look much more at them. Their names will come up again and again as we move into the very end of the 15th century, which is kind of where we're headed now. Antonio Pollaiuolo. These names are Greek. They all mean something to Italians, right? Verrocchio means dead eye. Vera, true. Occhio, eye. Right? The guy with good sight, good observational skills. My college roommate in grad school called him Dead-Eye Dick, right? Because that's kind of what his name is like. Pollaiuolo, son of a chicken farmer. Polo, right? There's the Pollo alla Brasa just down here next to Casats, right? Breaking Bad, right? The Pollo Hermanos. We're watching Better Call Saul now, so which I'm not going to be able to watch this weekend either, right? But Antonio is the son of a chicken farmer. And these names often tell us something that's kind of important about the Renaissance. And with Pollaiuolo, it's that many of our Renaissance artists came from working class backgrounds. That the Renaissance was very much a period where you made your future, which is a total break from the Middle Ages. Right? Throughout the Middle Ages, if you were born peasant, farmer, that's where you stayed. You worked really hard, you might get congratulated, but there's no ladder to climb, right? Because of the feudal system, right? There is no way to climb from peasantry to nobility, right? And the only way to climb from nobility is to make sure everybody ahead of you gets killed, right? Good work doesn't lead anywhere. The Renaissance, however, you can change your social status. You can move from A to B, right? The Medici came from a family of doctors, turned into bankers, and became leaders because they were able to change their status. Pollaiuolo, son of a chicken farmer, right, becomes prominent Renaissance artist through training and his own hard work, right? So this is a modern way of thinking. We often talk about the fact that the modern world is kind of born in the Renaissance, right? Some of these ideas that we have. Now, Pollaiuolo was a man of many different artistic traits. He was a printmaker, and we'll talk about that. This is a print, right? This is an engraving. But he was also a sculptor, and he was also a painter. And he also worked for the Medici family. Almost all of the artists we look at will work for the Medici family at one point or another because they're that kind of buyers of art. Here's a sculpture by Pollaiuolo that was made for the Medici. A small bronze, about like yay, right? Maybe 2 feet tall. Of Hercules and Antaeus, the legend of Hercules, the Greek hero who is given the tasks of the 10 hardest things to do in the world, and it's through his wits he's able to accomplish each of these. Antaeus was the son of the earth, got all of his strength from the earth. Hercules realizes that to get past him, he's got to defeat him. But in Greco-Roman wrestling, if you start on the ground, he just gets stronger because he got all this energy from it. So he breaks the rules. He's Captain Kirk in Star Trek 2. He breaks the rules to win the game. He lifts him off the ground, and all of his energy drains away. Our work over here doesn't have such a mythological basis, but rather seems to be only based on the idea of gladiators in training. You notice that with both of these, we are now seeing this new phase of the Renaissance that I talked about at the beginning of class. Roman subject matter for its own sake. Hercules, right? Not a Christian theme. Although in Neoplatonism, people thought Hercules, Jesus, because he also was able to conquer death in his way, right? Our gladiators on the right, we think, gladiators, simply seems to be a work that shows off what Pollaiuolo did best. And from these two works, you can see that that's the human body in action. He's studying anatomy. And as Renaissance artists are looking back at ancient Roman statues for their inspiration, they're also beginning to do dissection. Study anatomy quasi-scientifically. And there's this myth that we often hear about them sneaking around at night and stealing bodies in order to do this, but that's kind of a myth, right? People didn't like it, but they didn't have to sneak in order to do it, right? It was accepted, but, kind of looked down on. So you can see from these that his understanding of anatomy is really pretty strong. And what he's showing us with the Battle of the 10 Nudes is his ability to render the human body engaged in strenuous activity. And that's what he does in most of his paintings and sculptures as well. Right? Strenuous action of the human body. So this interest in Roman subject matter for its own sake, still philosophically tied to Christianity, but not an overtly Christian scene, is something that typifies this new third phase of the Renaissance. And will continue into the early 16th century, something we now call the High Renaissance, right? Proto-early High. High Renaissance being the full development, right? everything that was started with Giotto and Duccio, developed with Donatello and Masaccio, comes to fruition. Late 15th, early 16th century. Okay. Now, the work of art, I got a slide coming up somewhere, right? Like I said, seems to be showing off his ability to work the body in motion. And one of the things that's always struck me about this print is a lot of the images, a lot of the figures, the 10 moves, seem to be the same pose seen from different points of view. So our central two gladiators are more or less, even though they're holding that chain, right, are more or less the same pose seen from back and front, with slight variations. And since Pollaiuolo is a sculptor, it makes sense that he can think about the body as a three-dimensional object and imagine what it looks like from the other side. We saw Masaccio doing the same thing, didn't we? When we talked about that friendly rivalry between painters and sculptors, the paragone, right? He is both a painter and a sculptor. And he approaches his two-dimensional works almost like he's thinking in three dimensions, right? Thinking as a sculptor. So if you look at those two guys with the swords, you can see that the rearing back with your weight on one leg and lifting the weight off of the other is very similar in both of them. Not a direct mirror, but a close analogy. The two guys with the battle axes, sort of seem like the same pose, seen from opposite directions. Right? Reviewing it around, and the more that we look at things, the more we see the man with the arrow, the man with the sword, as striding forward, as again, repeating the same pose, but viewing it from a different side. Right? All of this is done in engraving. Now, this requires a bit of explanation. Some of you may know this, you might be taking classes. We have a new printmaking studio in the art department. We're offering now printmaking classes where you have the opportunity to do something similar to this. In the Renaissance, engraving was metal on metal. And what you did is you took a plate of soft metal, usually copper, right? And you would carve it with a sharp object called a burin that you see in the hand on the right here, that you would carve out the lines on this flat plate. And you can see it would kick them out in little pig's tail curlicues. And the depth of the line determined the darkness of the line. And the principle is that on a flat, smooth surface, you can rub ink into any variation to that surface. And then polish off the flat parts. You then run it under a press, and the press pushes the paper into the cracks that you've carved, right? And pulls the ink off, and you get an impression. And the nice thing about this is, you make one matrix, and you can make multiples from that one. Unlike making a very elaborate pen drawing, where all you get is one thing, right? Printmaking allows you to put all that work into carving the drawing onto a plate, but then from that plate, multiples, right? Today it's all done photomechanically, right? It's much easier now. You Photoshop, hit print, right? But this is the artist's prints, right? So engraving, it originally came out of people who made decorative armor for celebrations like we were talking about. Because sometimes those things like what Giuliano was wearing with the face on it, right, will have other areas where there'll be scenes that will be carved into the metal. Done the same way, right? Carved with what's called a burin to get those lines out. And printmaking seems to have come directly from that. And we begin to see these engravings right around 1430 or so. Right, so it's a relatively new technology. But it goes hand in hand with advances in printing, because the Gutenberg press is also mid-15th century. This idea of taking a surface, inking it, and transferring that into a piece of paper for something closer to mass production. Right. So is that pretty clear how that works? carve into the plate, rub ink all over it, and then polish it with your hand, and the ink stays in the lines and polishes off the smooth bit. And then under high pressure, right, rollers and whatnot, it passes through a press, and the paper will pull the ink out of those cracks, and you get your design in reverse on the page. Which means that for Polaiolo, the words that you see on the upper left corner had to be carved backwards. And the entire design would be carved backwards because when it printed, right, the other way around.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
In this drawing, the people look like they're living at the gym. They're very fit.
They are very, very
And
fit.
I can't imagine, was this the example of a person, or, showing all this musculature, or more likely this study of anatomy that you talked about?
Or none of the above. So the question, if you can hear in the back, is, okay, everybody is hyper fit. What's going on? That's kind of the bottom line. And I think I've kind of talked about this a bit. It's worthwhile mentioning again. With the two classes, I can't tell who I said what to. So, one of the things that we see happening in Italy as we move into the 15th century is not only a study of Roman sculpture, and those body types are, that helps to explain this, right? That it's a kind of body that one sees when one looks at Greco-Roman sculpture, right? That ultra fit. There are very, very few fat people in Greco-Roman sculptures, right? There's a few, but there are very few, right? They're usually like philosophers, right? Sometimes they're fat, you know. In the same way you don't see many bearded people. Again, philosophers wear beards, right? And at the same time they're studying anatomy, but what they're doing with both of these studies, whether it's sculpture or anatomy, is that they are taking what they've learned. And Van Eyck, if he'd done this, would have been very particular and detailed and sort of exactly what he saw. But what the Italians are doing, and this fits kind of with what's going on in the Italian Renaissance, is they take those observations and they apply them to an ideal of perfection. And the Romans have done that too, right? That is based on idealized proportions. So if I were to line everybody up against the wall and have you measure your forearm from your wrist to your elbow, and then measure from your elbow to your shoulder, and figure that out as a ratio of A to B, you would find as many different ratios as there are people in this room. But to the Greeks and the Romans and the Italians and the Renaissance, there is an ideal, as a perfect, of what that is, right? That A is to B, as B is to C, as C is to D, right? And it goes right down to the fingers, right? So the finger is to the hand, as the hand is to the arm, as the arm is to the torso. And instead of accounting for the difference that every body presents, they came up with a rational scheme of proportions. Now, this is based again on looking back at ancient Greek and Roman art. The one guy we kept showing you, the spear bearer by Polykleitos, right, standing here, so the contraposto guy, right? That was actually used to teach a set of rational proportions that govern the perfect human body. And there was a book that went with it, and it was a bronze. See how long that took? I clicked that like before I sat over here, and it just changed. That statue was originally bronze, and there were multiple versions of it that one could use, and it was used as a teaching tool. This is what the body should look like. Not what it doesn't like, but what it should look like. Right? And everybody's got that, don't we? I mean, every culture has its, ideal of perfect beauty. And so the bodies that you're seeing here are observation from anatomical studies, observation from art historical studies, and that's those two sets of observations tied to a sense of perfection and idealism. And that perfecting process, that rationality, is actually a hallmark of the Renaissance. Because what the Renaissance was interested in, just even beyond art, is in general, was the importance of human reason. One of the worksheets asked you about humanism, right? Rational humanism in the 15th century. And that interest in reason and the ability of mankind to think it through, right? To understand. And so what we see in the Renaissance art in Italy that we really don't see up north is an interest in these governing principles, if you will. Whether it's the ideal body type that we see here, or whether it's perspective, a rational one-point perspective, which also is not how we experience the world, because we got two eyes. One-point perspective, in order for one-point perspective to work, you have to close one eye and never move, and not even turn your head, because as soon as you do, the perspective shifts. But we all have binocular vision. So in a sense, Van Eyck's multiple vanishing points is actually closer to what we experience than Brunelleschi's one-point perspective is. Because that's not, we move. Our experience is about like moving through space, right? But the Italians want to rationalize that. They want to get rid of those imperfections. And so we end up with 10 guys who basically have the same body, each and every one of them. Long answer, but does that get it for you? Yeah? But it's an important element of what makes the Renaissance, is this interest in perfected, idealized forms. That slide came up magically. I wanted it to come up, but it came up magically because it shows us how Pollaiuolo engraves. So all of the lines that you see, the darker lines are cut deeper, the lighter lines are cut thinner, right? Because it'll hold more ink that way. But what's fascinating about the way he engraves is you'll notice that there's very little in the way of cross-hatching, right? And a couple of ways you can build up tone if you're drawing, right? And if you're limited to line, right? You don't get to wash anything, right? You don't get to smear things. And one way is you bring the lines just closer together. The other way is to do cross-hatching. This is really working well, isn't it? Right? But the other, it's just erasing it. When I do that, but you get the idea. You know what cross-hatching is, right? So one set of lines goes, and the other set of lines goes this way. And as you do that enough times, right, you can build up tone. That's not what Pollaiuolo is doing. All of his lines pretty much run in one direction. And they're really wonderful because if you think about it, like right down here, look at his, what are those, pecs? What are these down here? Lateral, these guys. No, those are back here. But anyway, I took anatomy and physiology. I was an undergrad. It was 30 years ago. I can be forgiven for forgetting it. But you see that they look like zigzags? And the way he's making them with that view is he's going this way. He turns the plate around, he goes back the other way. Turns the plate around, goes back this way. Right? Those are. It's not just doing this, but it looks like it is. Right? So all of the lines that you see here, he has this habit of just doing it in one direction as he cuts those lines out. And each line can start light, get dark, and then end light as well. Right? If you carve it looking like a watermelon wedge, right? Sharp at the edges and deep like that. Then you get a line that is thinner and thicker, and you can even see some of these look that way, like right there. Right? That set of lines. Okay, so this is engraving as a process. And the point of engraving, the point of making any kind of printmaking, is the fact that you get the multiples. That you've made the one thing, and from that one thing, you can distribute, right? You can publish your work and spread it wide. And it's signed in the back in Latin. Opus Antoni Pollaiuolo, his name's so long, you couldn't even get it on one line. Florentini. So this is the work of Antonio Pollaiuolo of Florence. And that becomes a really fascinating part of this because I think that what this print was made to do was to distribute. To show people what is he good at? The human body in action. Anatomy. If you want that, where do you find him? Florence. Right? It's a calling card of sorts. That's big. It's not like this, right? Which, if you think about it as a calling card, but also if you think about it as a smooth piece of copper in a pre-industrial age, you can buy a piece of copper this big on Amazon for about 20 bucks, right? Use it for an engraving if you wanted to. That's being hammered, right, by hand to get to be smooth enough that it doesn't catch ink except for where he manipulates it. And that in itself is pretty fantastic, right? That craftsmanship that even before he got it. But the edges that you see have been trimmed right to the edge of the plate. Most of the surviving impressions have, because it was handed around. Right? But it ends up being for him a calling card for what he does and what he does best. Right? But we also have to remember that this is very much a hallmark of the Renaissance in that it's a ancient scene, right? It's a non-Christian scene. A scene derived not necessarily from pagan mythology, but from Roman customs. That's now being revived. So the Renaissance, if we think about the Renaissance as the revival of ancient Rome, it happens in steps. And it's only by the end of the 15th century that we get to sort of a full revival of ancient Rome. At least in art, right? But again, that revival is going on in literature. Poetic forms are being borrowed from the Romans. It's going on in a sense of civic engagement. Right? Roman ideals are being revived as well. It's not just in the arts. Right? So our Venus on the half shell, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, is also a symbol of this revival of ancient Rome, this third phrase. And I guess I didn't realize I was going to already have explained this. So my slides are, this is where it started, Roman realism. We've said this today already. Here's Roman figure types. Okay, fine. And now we're at Roman subject matter. Okay? So this is exactly what I've sort of been over a couple times already, right? Let's see where my page here is. I've lost my pagination. What do I want to talk about here? Right, okay. I was going to see if I was going to talk about this painting or not. We should, because you've seen it before, right? I mean, not just in this class, but it's one of those paintings that people see without going into art history classes, because it's kind of that kind of famous. Okay. It's a celebration of ancient Rome, but certainly to any viewer in the 15th century, they would have also drawn the same sorts of analogies to the Virgin Mary that we talked about with Filippo Lippi, right? That there is a connection philosophically, not theologically, but philosophically, between Venus and Mary. And Lippi's coming at it from one direction, Botticelli from the other direction, right? And again, Neoplatonism made this all obvious to anyone. Now, our work here was also commissioned by the Medici. Right? We can't get away from these guys. By the Medici family. And the image of Venus, the actual pose taken by Venus, is borrowed from a sculpture that the Medici family owned. This is an ancient Roman. It's often called a Venus pudica, means the modest Venus, because she's kind of trying to cover herself up, right? The Venus de Milo would have been one of these before she lost her arms, right? Right. That's what those arms would have been doing before they were disappeared. And you can see the placement of the hand that's holding her long, flowing red hair is, in fact, in almost exactly the same position. There's been some talk whether or not her face is Simonetta Vespucci, because Botticelli knew her, and in memorial of her, but that's impossible to prove. I've seen portraits of her, but again, going back to Elizabeth's question, that same idealization that we see in the body sometimes applies to facial beauty too, right? That they'll kind of look the same. Okay, so this is made for the Medici. This is and is specialized for them, right? Choices were made with knowing that that's who's going to buy this. The person who commissioned it was Lorenzo de' Medici, who we just saw, right? And he commissioned this as a temporary work of art, which is kind of fascinating. At this point in Italy, they're still painting on wood panels, even large works. And this is about 8 feet across the base. It's pretty big, right? And so the norm is to paint on wood, but this is on canvas, which we're kind of used to now. That's what artists paint on these days, right? But it was uncommon in the 15th century to paint on canvas. Most paintings on canvas were made as decorations, to be hung up and thrown away when you're done. Temporary works of art. And this one, we're pretty sure Lorenzo commissioned it for the wedding of his cousin, who, just to make it confusing, is also named Lorenzo, right? Lorenzo di Pier Angelico or something like that, right? Don't worry about it. And if we think about this as being the decoration for a wedding, it begins to make a little bit more sense. Because here's Venus being welcomed by springtime, about to throw that cloak over her naked body. You can see the collar of the cloak off her elbow there, right? She's being welcomed at shore after having been born at sea, winds blowing her in and flowers everywhere. And in fact, even though there's a sense of deep depth, the background is really simplified so that you see these 4 figures very, very clearly. Like you might see at a distance when it's kind of a background decoration. Right? So it's going to make some sense this way, right? That it was in fact a decoration. Did I tell you guys about how Venus was born? This is how she was linked to the Virgin Mary as well. She was born by a miraculous melding of heaven and earth, right? Of the physical world and the heavenly realm. And not exactly like the Virgin Mary by any means, or Jesus for that matter. One of the gods in the Greco-Roman pantheon is Uranus, after whom the planet is named, right? Just so you don't think I'm swearing, right? And by legend, the god of time, Kronos, castrated Uranus. And when he did, the testicles were thrown to earth and they fell into the sea. And that melding of the ocean with the semen of the god is what gave birth to Venus. And also by Roman legend, why you get foam. It makes you just disgusting next time you go to the beach, right? Why you get sea foam as well. So here she is after that sort of, I used to listen to I still do listen to a lot of Tom Waits, and at one point he talked about this famous story. This is total, put down your pen. I should turn off the recorder. This famous story in the Civil War about a woman who got pregnant because a stray bullet had gone. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a legend. I've heard it before. How a bullet had gone through a soldier and wedged in a woman's uterus, and it transferred the semen. Right? So it's sort of like it's alternative way for childbirth, and not necessarily for everybody. Right? Is what I said. It's a different form of a natural form of virgin birth. And so the fact that she's virgin birth, right, in a way, right? That there's this idea of God and man. So sorry, that's a total random aside. This is my problem when I get tired, right? These things hit in my head, and I can't let go, and I don't know when to shut up.
Like elaborate ways to cover up that you're not really a virgin.
I think Venus doesn't have to worry about it.
Not Venus, but
the other guy. It could well be. Well, anyway, right? Commissioned by. Let's get back to it. Commissioned by Lorenzo. Isn't that much more fun than just saying commissioned by Lorenzo for a marriage of his nephew? And there she is, the goddess of love. Now I know all this other stuff about her too. Botticelli studied under Verrocchio. Right? We mentioned that before. Botticelli started his career as an apprentice under Filippo Lippi, and it was quite normal for artists to move from one artist to the next as they're developing on the training, right? And so even though he's painting on his own already, while he's working for Filippo Lippi, he would go on to continue that apprenticeship, maybe like as a shop assistant. And the reason is that it's very, very difficult to set up your own shop. Right? It's really difficult to huge cash investments. Sometimes you got to, save up some money while you're working on And so what Botticelli did is, remember he was like 15 when he painted that Madonna and Chavez in the National Gallery, right? He later went on to work in the shop of Verrocchio in the 1470s, like around 1470, 75. He's in Verrocchio's shop. Now Verrocchio, remember, is a sculptor we see here, but he was also a painter. In fact, we have a Verrocchio painting in the National Gallery. Right? And he ran a shop with more than one shop assistant slash pupil. And at the same time that Botticelli is working for Verrocchio, so is Leonardo da Vinci. Right? They are roughly the same age. Botticelli is just a little bit older, but they are both apprenticing side by side under Verrocchio. So we are, who's working on this? Is that this class or the other one? Is anybody working on this in this class? Somebody else is doing a paper on this. Ginevra da Vinci is the only painting by Leonardo in all of the Americas. Right? If you think, one of the things that stunned me when I started to learn about the National Gallery is the degree to which that collection is phenomenal. We talked about that Verrocchio, well, this one, right? We just talked about him. Talk about a pedigree, right? How important that is as a cultural artifact, right? Or the portrait of Giovanni, just after. These are important, and they're all there. And that museum, they started gathering those works for the museum in 1937. That's not that long ago, right? 75 years ago, 80 years ago. At which time, the Metropolitan Museum in New York had already been open for 50 to 75 years. Philadelphia Museum had already been open. European museums have gone back further. And they're able to get this incredible range of works. They don't have, there's a Leonardo drawings in the Met in New York. They don't have a painting. No one in America has a Leonardo painting except for us. Right? So that in itself, okay, yeah, but it's not the Mona Lisa. There are maybe a dozen finished, completed Leonardo pictures in the world. Maybe a dozen. Because he didn't like to finish things. Right? He got bored working on it. And he would just drop it. Move on. And we've got one of the finished ones. So it's pretty incredible. Right? We've got these things. And I try to note when we can, like this is just, again, we're so lucky. Right? And it's free. And it's never really all that crowded. Some of the shows can be, right? But pop over to the galleries, go to the Met and go to their Italian Renaissance galleries, and if they had a Leonardo, you would never see it. You'd see the backs of people's heads and their freaking cell phones, selfie sticks and stuff, right? So we're very, very lucky to have this. Now, the painting has been, I got to teach a class after this too. I'm losing my voice. The painting's been trimmed. You'll notice it's almost perfectly square, but it's missing part of it at the bottom. And we can tell this very easily because when we look at the panel, usually when they're, again, it's painted on a panel, right, on a canvas, and the painter will usually leave a little edge around the edge of the panel where the frame will look over. And it's called the barb, right? So there's almost always in the panel painting an edge that's unpainted, a little strip around the sides. And there's a strip on the front, on the left, the top, the right, but not on the bottom. The paint goes right to the edge, so we know it's been trimmed, right? And furthermore, the standard pose would be down to sort of waist with the hands. That's the norm for portraits, as you see for half the body. And the hands are an important part of the portrait. This is an important part of who our characters are, right? And so she originally, we think, looked like that. And the reason we think she looked like that is there's this drawing for hands that would make perfect sense with her, right? So this is sort of a recreation of what the curators at the National Gallery think she would have originally looked like. And I sort of put this together here, right, with the two bits. So what we're left with on the front is just sort of 2/3, 3/4 of the original. But she would have then been down to roughly her waist. And the hands, Leonardo loves using hands eloquently. Right, those poses as they created each other, adding to the character of the figure. Now, I want to use this picture to talk about what's really fantastic about Leonardo. Why do we put him in this level of greatness? Right? Why is he
why is the Mona Lisa the most famous picture in the world? Right? What is it about Leonardo that you can come with this and say, okay, maybe first, probably the smartest guy that ever lived. A mathematician, a geologist, an inventor, tried his hand at sculpture. He made an over life-size equestrian portrait for the Duke of Milan, 27 feet tall out of clay. The French troops shot it to pieces, right? Disappeared. Could do almost anything he put his hand to, right? How are we in 15 or 20 minutes today or Tuesday going to have any insight on that? How am I, Mary, I'm even Yale. How am I going to tell you anything about him, right? I'll tell you what I think is cool about it, right? One of the things that, and this is something that's also out there in the literature, one of the things that Leonardo loves to do with his pictures is he loves to blur the lines that define one shape from another shape. He likes things to meld together. So as you look at the landscape over her left shoulder here, right? That tree that rises up, and we see down below the reflection in the water, we can see how some of the paint's kind of bubbled up. He always thought he knew a better way to paint, and sometimes he didn't, right? It messed up. This is probably a case of that. But there's thumbprints here. You can actually see Leonardo's thumbprint in some of the, if you get it close enough to it, right? Take a telescope so they won't yell at you. But if you look at the bottom of those trees and then how they come down to the shore that sweeps out from the right into the middle, you notice it becomes very difficult to tell where the tree stops and things get lost in shadow. Things seem to sort of fall back in and emerge back out. If you look past that shoreline to the back where it's blue and green, you see it just starts to meld together. Kind of dreamy, you know? And that's something that Leonardo loves to do because he likes to think of nature as something that's always changing. Always in flux. And if he defines it too precisely, then it freezes it. And that's not how he thinks nature really works. For him, nature is always changing. So how do you do that with a static work of art? This melding of things is one of the ways to get away with that, right? Over and above that, I mentioned that he doesn't like finishing things. He really hates, he loves planning. He loves getting things out there, figuring out how it's going to work, and then executing, he'll get started, but as soon as he's got it done in his head, as soon as he's figured out all the problems and how he's going to solve them, he's bored as can be, and he'll drop it if he can. Right? And that goes back to what Elizabeth was asking earlier about Paul Lagola's figures. There's this thing in the Renaissance about the importance of the human intellect. How ideas are formed here. And when they come out there, it's not as good as it is when it's inside your head. You guys all know this, right? I've seen you guys carrying around your interior design houses, right? And you got this, I know what it's going to look like. It's like that Simpsons when Homer's going to build a barbecue out back. And he's got this mental picture of what the barbecue's going to look like. And then he's got bricks stuck to him and he can't do anything because it never comes out the way you planned. Because we're imperfect, right? We're prone to screw things up. Leonardo loves giving us nature that you still have to complete part of it in your head. Right? You still have to think about what's going on in those shadows. He's not going to tell you. And that makes it better. Because it's here. Right? It's inside your head. It's not there on the canvas. Right? He loves that in his works. I think I have just one more thing to show you, if that's right. I do. The term he used for this is sfumato. He said he wanted the light to look smoky. Fume in French, right? Sfumato means smoky. And so it has this haze. Right? All of his pictures have this haze. That if you look through a smoky room, I don't see it very much, people smoke, right? But if you ever over fry your chicken at home or something, you start to realize that looking through haze, things start to meld together. And that's a technique he tries to apply to his paintings. So even as you look at things like the sign of her, the curls of her hair, there's this idea that they're kind of coming out of the mist, they're falling back into the mist, right? These shadows become engulfing, and everything is morphing and changing, and everything is completed by you in your mind. Okay, we'll finish Leonardo, move on to Raphael and Michelangelo on Tuesday, and we'll talk about the midterm then as well.